Thank you, and welcome to you all here in our studio audience tonight, and those of you over there in limbo. We're delighted that you all joined us here and out there at home as well. I want to quote to you. Quote, "In some ways, California, energetic, acquisitive, and narcissistic, is the best and worst of the American dream. And so is Ronald Reagan." That's a quote from this book. Want it over here? The book is called What Makes Reagan Run? And that's what the show is about tonight. My guests have rather different opinions about this question, so let's hear from them. First, the author of the book. He's been reporting on politics and urban problems for a good many years. He's been with the Associated Press, Time Magazine, and has contributed to most of the other major magazines in the country, Mr. Joseph Lewis. Joseph? Our second guest is the state chairman of the Friends of Governor Ronald Reagan, the chairman of the Favorite Son Committee, and in 1967 he served as legislative secretary to the governor, Mr. Jack Lindsay. Jack? Let's go back to that quote again first, Joseph. In some ways, California, energetic, acquisitive, and narcissistic, is the best and the worst of the American dream, and so is Ronald Reagan. What does that mean, the best of the American dream? What makes him the best of the American dream?
Well, I think you look at Ronald Reagan's life, that in many ways he's a very typical Californian, except that his success has been much greater than most of us will ever be fortunate enough to experience. Like many Californians, he came out from the Midwest, he worked hard, he found success in his chosen career, and he went up the ladder very, very fast. Some of it, no doubt, due to his own talent, some of it due to circumstances and timing, which many of us will never appreciate or enjoy. I think the best of it is the fact that he worked hard to get a goodly share of this world's goods. He got a family, went up through politics, and he made a name for himself in a very competitive business. As far as the worst goes, I think there's a tendency to buy a very superficial aspect of the American dream, what I would consider a distortion or a perversion of the American dream. A value system which is based solely on results, which, because of the competitiveness in the industry from which he came, and the industry which he went into, gives one a sort of tunnel vision, which is not necessarily something that is germane to one's character, but one develops an affliction to this kind of thing, because in order to have the kind of success that Ronald Reagan and others have had in politics, one has had to give up an awful lot. And I think somewhere along the line, he had to make that choice. And therefore, the title of his book, his autobiography, Where's the Rest of Me, is very apt, because going up that ladder one rung at a time is very, very difficult. And at times, the game itself is not worth the candle.
Do you think that up until the time of this sitting, that he's been an able governor?
By my box score, no. There are a number of facts in extenuation. It's very easy to give a yes or no answer to that. I think one of the problems has been, one of the reasons I want to write this book is because there's been a tendency of friends and foes to either idolize him or demonize him, either make him a clown or a right-wing pawn or a mouthpiece, when essentially he's really none of these things. He's a very complicated man, a very quick man, a very adroit man, who is able to see very well in a limited area, which concerns him. There are many of us who, in order to succeed in our fields, develop a sort of tunnel vision. And I feel as governor, he has not shown the broadness of insight and judgment to be the kind of governor that California expected when they turned down Pat Brown by 1 million votes. And ironically, Pat Brown himself, 8 years previous to that, had gone into office by a landslide margin slightly higher than the one that Reagan achieved. By the box score of legislative achievements, which is mitigated somewhat by the fact that he's faced a Democratic legislature, He has not, by his own admission, been a very effective governor. His own words were, "They won't let me be a good governor," which might be a very good position for him to be in. In other words, you could say, well, don't blame me, blame those sons of the guns in the legislature, and give me a legislature that I can work with, and I'll go to town and I'll get the program passed that you elected me to pass. However, even when there is a divided legislature, the business of governance continues. In our system, we have division of authority and responsibility, legislative, executive, judicial, and both parties contribute to the housekeeping of government. Now, in the 8 months since I finished writing this book, there have been a number of important bills that have come up in the legislature. Frankly, it is very difficult to determine the real thrust and momentum of the Reagan program. He talks what I would consider a conservative line, and yet the program itself is not all that conservative. In some ways, he's doing essentially what Pat Brown has to do, or what any governor has to do, and you have to carry water on both shoulders. You can't appeal to just one narrow sect, no matter how much they like to hear what you have to say. But nevertheless, in terms of a box score, there have been a number of bills. Property tax relief is hung up. Tax reform, which was one of the big issues in the 1966 campaign, he hasn't proposed anything specifically along those lines. He's had an anti-obscenity bill in, which failed. There's been a welfare bill to cut down the number of children on AFDC from 6 to 4, making it a maximum of 4, which also has been killed. He had a reorganization.
Just generally, before we get into all the specifics, generally you would say that he has not been...
His batting average has not been high, but he's also been hampered by a Democratic legislature. Okay. So there's that mitigating factor.
Jack, did you read the book, didn't you?
Yes, I did.
And what was your evaluation of the book as a member of the Reagan team?
Well, I had an evaluation of it from many points of view, including as a member of the Reagan team. First, I might say, from a point of view of history, I found some interesting insights into some of the previous campaigns that were developed in the campaign, especially the Salinger-Murphy race, the Reagan-Brown race in '66, which was the basis of a great deal of the book. But I found some paradoxes in the book, as I find here in Joe's opening comments. Joe seems to recognize the virtues that Mr. Reagan has, his qualities, his quickness, his facility in many areas, the fact that he has demonstrated an ability to make progress in his chosen careers and in more than one career, that he has exhibited this talent to not only on his own merit, but on the thrust of others who support him to be willing to move him forward. And yet, both in the book and in the opening comments tonight, there's a suggestion that there's having attained this success, there's a penalty that goes with it, that there is the opposite problem that has to go with it. And I notice this is a thread in the book, and it's a basic point that I would disagree with.
Well, the feeling that I got from reading the book, and I came away from it, was that he feels that the governor is facile, certainly, glib, adroit, but on a very superficial level. I never got the feeling that Joe felt that Governor Reagan was a man of great intellectual stature or depth. He refers to him as a Reader's Digest reader and quoter several times during the book.
Yes, but
he tends to dispel the myth that he is truly a political amateur and a citizen politician by developing the theme that he had been kind of pointing in this direction for many, many years, traveling around the country, working in public relations for GE, having made the conversion from a liberal Democrat to a Republican, to a conservative Republican, and so forth.
Yes, but you see, unless you're following in the same thought pattern, you say he...
I hope so, because I'm trying to quote from the book.
Let me see if I can develop what I think you've just said, reflecting the book. Number one, that he destroyed the myth that in fact that he was glib, and that destroyed the myth that he was a citizen politician and inexperienced. And yet I was impressed, as I mentioned to Joe before we came on the air, and some of the things that I learned in the book. For example, when the professors who were part of his research team were visiting in his home and had conversations at length about all these books on the walls that he had, and that there was quite a paragraph in the book about how the governor brought forth his own clippings of the research that he had been doing in depth for years. And I thought it was a very honest position to take, to point out that the governor, in fact, writes his own speeches, was very sensitive about the public and private accusations, that in fact he was mouthing somebody else's speeches, that he writes his own material, he thinks through his own positions, that he never does very well with a written speech, that to quote the book directly, as I recall, he likes to wing it. And,
he does worse on a prepared text.
In terms of presentation, in terms of working with somebody else. Sure.
And excuse me, Jack, I'll come back to you. I'll
right.
take a break for a commercial.
Right.
We'll be back in just about a minute or so from right now.
Sorry, I didn't mean to...
Jack, I think we interrupted you when we broke for that commercial. Would you like to pick up your thread about where you left off?
Let me suggest this in terms of a thought that Joe started with about how an individual, whether it's the governor or anyone else, makes progress through hard work, talent, and sponsorship in any career. I'm not sure that it follows that a person loses his perspective. I think in the governor's case, based on what I have seen in the man and my visits with him, in the way he has responded to various issues, I sense a tremendous appreciation for the system and the environment that permitted him to come through. A Harvard sociologist referred to it once as a knothole class. You put a plank on the lawn, and where there's a knothole, someone is permitted to grow through into a different social situation. And certainly we know from the governor's biography that he came from very modest circumstances. And I have never felt that he ever lost perspective of his background and the great opportunities that he had in this country. And I see much evidence that this has been translated in terms of making certain, at least in terms of his contributions to the system, to legislative goals, whatever, to make sure that some of the system or a major portion of the system still works so that everybody has the same kind of opportunities. Now, it's true if we start arguing or discussing sense of values and what should determine a person's goal in life, but this is a very subjective matter, and we'd all have different opinions on that. But certainly in terms of providing for your family and freedoms and progress in a chosen career, staying away from interference by government, a lot of other virtues, I think it's very important to recognize that, in fact, the governor has real perspective on these.
I'd like to speak to these virtues. You know, there's a famous saying that there are no second acts in American life. And most of us come from humble beginnings, or lower middle class or middle class beginnings, and through hard work and effort, application, we take a regular haircut or whatever it is, we go up the ladder. That's the first act. And after that, a man reaches a stage in his life where he begins to wonder, well, what does it all mean? I'm going to leave a certain portion of my world's goods to my family. I'll give to the community chest and the Red Cross, leave a scholarship for college students. But over and beyond these things, what is the meaning of life? What is the meaning of all the things that he's gone through? Now, I think there's a great tendency in American life where success plays such an important part, be it not so much even success, but particularly in Southern California, the appearance of success is very important. That it dissipates the energy that it would have gone into the things that one would have looked at once one reached the level where all one's economic needs are attained. I think there are too many people in and out of the motion picture business, in and out of politics, for whom there are no second acts in life, whose constant concern is, well, what kind of billing am I getting? What do the critics think of me? Now, this is a disease that afflicts us. Now, I don't know how we're ever going to rid ourselves of it. But I think in the career of Ronald Reagan and in the career of other politicians that we have seen, the show aspect of the career is emphasized of necessity, because you have to be a showman to get to that position, but it is emphasized at the cost of many, many other values. It is true that Reagan worked hard, and others worked hard, and others are equally talented and haven't made it. There are people who come from poor families who are devastated from infancy because they've been conditioned to accept poverty. That poverty is the only condition they know. There are families that are decimated by centuries and generations of a kind of grinding poverty that we knew only during the Depression. For some families in America, the Depression never ended. And I think the measure of a politician's stature is what he is willing to do to alleviate the condition of people for whom the Depression never ended in a time of general affluence, when poverty is very subtly hidden in Los Angeles, in Chicago, in San Francisco, in New York. You know, there's an old saying that when you drive through Southern California, you don't see the cemeteries. They all look like golf courses. Well, in a sense, poverty looks like a golf course. It's something you drive by on the Harbor Freeway to downtown. There are miles and miles, 55 square miles in Los Angeles. Now, it's very easy for someone to say, I did it. I achieved such and such. I've made it. They're having a ball with my hard-earned tax money raising illegitimate kids. I don't think so. I don't think anyone has a ball with tax money when they have to go on the dole.
No, and I'm sure that you were not attributing that quote to the governor.
But I say there's this attitude that is reflected in the opposition to many of the social welfare programs that have existed.
But again, I'm sure you're not attributing that attitude to the governor.
I'm not attributing that specifically,
yes.
But I think his campaign, his success, is partly due to that attitude, a great resentment among people, not all of them who are wealthy. A lot of people voted for him who made less than $7,000 a year. Yes. But they paid taxes, and they resent the demands that are being made on them in a state which is growing beyond anyone's calculations. Well, I think some of his success is due to that.
Yes. Joe, I think we should approach it perhaps from a different point of view. By your standards of definition of a person making success and gaining certain accomplishments, material goals, recognition, certainly Governor Reagan had accomplished all of these things. He had to be
unquestionably.
And so at this point, matter of fact, I was interested in noting in your book that he was making well into the six figures. So from your definition of material standards accomplishment, this man said, if certain people indicate that they would like me to represent the party and run for the governor, I'm willing to give all this up if I have an opportunity to serve. Now, that seems to be taking a difference in what you're saying. Now, a second point related to that. Not only did the governor...
In other words, you're saying he ran for governor at a great financial sacrifice.
I'm not sure it was a sacrifice. What he was saying is that by your definition of all that was important, he was willing to say, this is not important as compared to the opportunity to serve.
Well, he had attained what he had set out to do as far as...
I'm not sure. I don't know what he has...
material abundance.
I'm not sure I know what he had set out to do. I'm not sure that you know either. All I know is that by your definition, he had accomplished quite a standard and was willing to set that aside in order to serve. Now, I'd make the point the other way. And this is a very narrow point that I want to make. I don't want to open it up on the other issues. But in terms of the people who served on his staff, he made it a point that he didn't want anybody on his staff who would be making more money than what they were making on whatever job they had before they came into state government. He didn't want anybody reaching for the job for purposes of making money. And I know many cases, to me, are quite impressive as to the amount of, if you will, sacrifice that people were willing to make a commitment to serve government for some period of time in Sacramento in order to support some of the programs.
It also would suggest, would it not, that he surrounded himself with nothing but wealthy, big business individuals.
Well,
I mean, it would seem that there are two sides to that coin.
Do you actually think he made a financial sacrifice by going into government? Does any man consciously make a financial sacrifice to go into government for selfless deprivation of his material or depletion of his material abundance, just to answer the call of the people?
I think that there is always a great element of statesmanship in any public servant, regardless of party, that has to be a basic motive as to why he's involved. Because the punishments and the abuses and the sacrifices and the family life that all public servants, again, without regard to party, what they pay in terms of personal penalties is something that you can't weigh in terms of how much money they had or did not have before.
Unless you weigh it in terms of the rewards to the ego, to be the man.
And this is also
I mean, that's a compensating
and this is also a common definition for any public service, again, without regards to party. I'm sure that you would agree with that.
Excuse me, again,
Yes.
I must take a break. We'll be back in just about a minute or so from right now. Our two guests tonight are extremely well-mannered and both great gentlemen, but what they were saying, however veiled, number one, Joseph Lewis, who wrote the book What Makes Reagan Run, was suggesting that Governor Reagan was in fact an ego-driven individual who was not giving up a great deal in the way of personal sacrifice when he ran and became governor. Jack Lindsay, who is the state chairman of the Friends of Reagan, is suggesting that, no, that's not the case. Governor Reagan is, in fact, a humble, dedicated public service who bowed his head and answered the clarion call of the people. And that's where we left off at the break.
Could I develop another point, Les, that was included in your opening question and Joe's opening remarks? To the fact as to whether or not the governor has attained any success as a governor. And I think you have to go back and define the issues that we saw in 1966, the commitments the governor made to the people, and then measure specifically his performance against his campaign commitments and what has happened in the last 18 months since he's been in Sacramento. And one of the things that impressed me, frankly, because as a lay student of politics and politicians, everybody's aware of what constitutes a political promise. But after the November election in 1966, one of the first things the governor did was to appoint what he called a legislative task force. And they had as their job, this was chairman by State Senator George Duke Machen from Long Beach, and was representative of the party and of the party leaders and the legislators, the incumbents and newly elected, and administration and staff people. And their basic charter was to come forward first with the inventory of all of his campaign promises and translate that into a legislative program. Now, he has never veered from that. He has never backed off from a campaign commitment. Matter of fact, as of the close of this session, of the targets that he set, he has accomplished, box score, 54% of all of his legislative goals that he has set out to accomplish.
How do you determine that box score?
Well,
what legislative goals are you speaking of? Major legislation?
I would say major and minor, that of the total package that he proposed 18 months ago. Now, and the reason I say that major and minor, because there's some major elements that are still missing. Example, his commitment during the campaign, a heavy commitment, that he felt, based on his 25 years active union leadership, that union members should have the right of secret ballot in policy matters in their unions.
That was killed for the second straight session.
That was killed, that's correct. But it's still a part of the governor's program. Now, in California, we had the major issue in 1966, Proposition 16, called Pornography Bill.
That also was killed in this session.
That was also killed in this session.
Bill that
That's correct.
Advocated.
Now, so in your analysis, has the governor been successful? I think you have to recognize, as you have, that these parts of his legislation have been killed. Now we have to examine why. And it's a very valid consideration to say, in fact, the Assembly has 42 Democratic votes and 38 Republicans. And Speaker Unruh is the leader of the 42, and it's a well-disciplined group. And unless the Democratic caucus is in total accord with the governor's position, it's not coming out. And that's true for the Criminal Procedures Committee on the Assembly side.
Some of his bills died there, too, in the Assembly Criminal Procedure.
But that's a Democratic-controlled committee.
But some of his legislation has also died in Republican-controlled committees.
I can't think of one committee that's Republican-controlled in the Assembly.
Well, wait a minute. It just occurs to me that we're doing a little nitpicking here, because the suggestion that I got from the book, Joe, was that you felt that Governor Reagan was elected for a series of reasons. Number one, you think he benefited because of his attractiveness, his personal appeal, his proven ability to deliver the speech, whatever that particular speech was. You felt that, Governor Brown, for all of his good intentions, is kind of a jovial, genial bumbler and was just ripe for the picking at that time. But you also suggested that there was somehow some kind of an unholy alliance, whether tacit or understood, between various oil interests, gasoline interests, and automobile manufacturing interests on the one hand, the now newly disenfranchised conservative wing of the Republican Party not having Barry Goldwater's standard to march behind in addition, and the white backlash you felt was a significant part of the support for Governor Reagan. Well, now I think that with these factors in the picture, to sit here and talk about an anti-pornography bill, or to talk about, which to me is absurd, when we're living in a time when the cities are threatening to come tumbling down around our ears, when the campuses are threatening to go up in flames, when these are the crisis issues of the time, we can sit here and talk about whether you should turn the speedometer back to zero, or whether you should have it, with the actual mileage on. That's kind of nitpicking. I think we ought to get to the heart of the matter, and is that what is the governor's orientation? What is his chosen mission, and is he, carrying out that mandate?
Well, let me try to respond, if I may. Let's go to a very basic issue, which has several facets. The issue of welfare and the cost of welfare. And this relates into the other issue of the cost of government and how many taxes people pay. It is fundamental to the governor's position. When you realize that we are now into the second and third, in some cases fourth generations of families on welfare, that welfare as a concept has not solved the problem. And so as a basic commitment and a basic concept on the governor's part, it's a total commitment to let's work out the program that will get people off of welfare. Now, how do you get people off of welfare? You don't just cut them off. You have to supplant the income from welfare with some other meaningful income, and that's why the heavy commitment to the job program, to the Chad McClellan program, which has been picked up by some 20 states, which in fact was picked up
started by Governor Brown.
Let
me say one thing here. Before we get on the welfare...
Joe, excuse me, I'm sorry. In 1966, Governor Brown's campaign commitment was that what we needed was $50 billion of federal money spent on programs in California in order to create more jobs
started
at the
Chad
federal
McClellan
level.
Doing this.
Well, I wouldn't take away anything from Chad McClellan. All I know is that Chad McClellan came forth as a result of the Watts riot, which was before Reagan's election.
He started working in the area then.
That's correct. And he came to full fruition in the program today because he was fully sponsored and is now picked up in 19 of our major cities in the state of California and in almost 20 states in the country that have sent representatives to California to find out what is this Chad McClellan program that's working in California.
But it seems to be working outside the ghetto much better than it is in the ghetto, because most of the accolades come from people who have never been in the ghetto. If you talk to the leaders of the community in Watts, they don't know very much about the program.
Joe,
they're very unsure about the statistical claims for it.
Right, now, Joe, now we're arguing about the merit of the program. Would you agree that what makes sense is to get people jobs and to get them off of welfare?
I think anything that helps to do that is a step forward.
Well, then you've recognized
that you can't say then that Reagan initiated that program, can you?
I'm not saying. I'm
that
saying
he continued it.
I'm saying that as a basic commitment that the governor to solve the problem is to find jobs for people. And it's working today, this year, it's working. And I wouldn't for a moment detract from any of the merit of the Chad McClellan program or what he has done to make the contribution.
Would you wipe out welfare for those who cannot get jobs?
Absolutely not, and nor would the governor. And that's his basic commitment.
But the question then really isn't welfare, because by the end of the 1966 campaign, Reagan had moved somewhat toward the left, and Brown had moved somewhat toward the right. As a matter of fact, he fired his welfare director. So essentially, we had a Tweedledum, Tweedledee position on welfare. There was no great split on welfare by the end of the campaign.
It was a basic split, Joe.
Pat Brown made a big switch after he fired his previous welfare director, John Wedemeyer.
You mean the last 2 weeks of the campaign he made a big switch?
No, it wasn't in the last 2 weeks. It was earlier in the campaign. And it didn't fool anybody, but he still, by the time the campaign had ended, the rhetoric was something like they were using interchangeable speeches, which is one of the problems of politicking in California or any other large state where you want to appeal to many blocks of people. I feel the heart of the 1960 campaign was not welfare. That aggravated the situation, bureaucratic excesses, was the great furor over the Rumford Fair Housing, Forced Housing, Open Housing Act, whatever you want to call it.
Joe, I got to break again. I'll come back to you. We'll be back in just about a minute or so from right now. So you were referring to the Proposition 14, I believe, basically.
Proposition 14 was the political expression of a problem that has been festering in California and every large industrial state with sizable minority concentrations. It was a tragedy that really is bipartisan. You cannot lay the blame for what preceded and followed Prop 14 at any one individual's doorstep or at any party. Nevertheless, the fact remains that in politics, the incumbents are stuck with the results of what happens. Just as I feel Reagan is stuck with 2 years of essentially a non-program in the legislature when you compare it to the first 2 years of Pat Brown, who, aided by a Democratic legislature, still passed a lot of legislation in his first 2 years. It's rather ironic that we consider Reagan, who is charismatic and articulate, as a very forceful, resolute man, and we say, poor old Pat Brown, and I've said it myself. And yet, if you look at the results, Pat Brown was an activist governor in the Warren Knight tradition of building for California. He made a lot of mistakes, but he had a deep commitment to the state in terms of water project, in terms of roads, in terms of a master plan for higher education, in terms of a Fair Employment Practices Commission, in terms of Consumer Council. You may not agree with all these things, but still he was an activist governor. He'd get things done, governor. Now, it came down in 1964. There had been trouble all over the country for years. It's something that had been gathering. And in the midst of all the racial unrest, tension, and the various polarizations, someone came up with the idea that it would be very nice if California passed a Fair Housing Act. It would make Pat Brown seem like a social innovator in terms of his great idol, Earl Warren. But unfortunately, you cannot just make liberal gestures. You have to have a serious commitment to what you're doing, what you're attempting to do. The Rumford Act was a flawed piece of legislation. It was badly written. There were too many cooks in the broth. And some of the key sections, ironically enough, were worked on by the lobbyist for the Real Estate Association to make it more palatable for the real estate industry. Ironically, as it was passed in the last minutes of the 1963 legislative session, the word was out, well, it won't do any harm, and it probably won't be forced too severely by the Fair Employment Practices Commission. And as matters went, nobody really understood what the bill was about and what it really covered. I checked with the Fair Employment Practices Commission several times, and I would get varying answers whenever I talked to anyone about just whom is covered by the bill and whom is excluded. There was some discrepancy about the number of houses and rental units, dwelling units.
What would get to the bottom line?
The bottom line is essentially this. The Rumford Housing Act epitomizes the liberal failure in California, which led to the election of Ronald Reagan. The way the Democrats mishandled that ball from start to finish and picked up something which they didn't fully understand, they hadn't prepared the public for, and they put in penal clauses which were very tending towards great costly and tedious litigation. Well, it gave anyone who ran as a Republican a wide open field to just play havoc with the incumbents. And and Pat Brown compounded his error after having signed the bill and praised it. by later going before his own state Democratic convention and urging a bipartisan commission to work out amendments when it had already become a principled cause. So the people, the liberals who had already come out for it, were left with nothing to hang their hats on. That essentially was where I thought the election was lost in the 1966 campaign.
That was that was basically a 64 issue. I would tend to assess the issues of 66 a little differently.
All right.
The tax load question, the finances in the state level were major issues. The problems of student demonstrations on the university campus was a major issue. The problem of the growth rate of the state of California, where, as a matter of the economics of our state, we have to create 250,000 new jobs every year just to keep even with our population
Jack,
growth.
you saw the polls. You knew that all of these were, with the exception of the university issue, were collateral issues, that the thing Californians were worried most about, the thing that had the most instantaneous recognition, people polled in California, north and south, black and white, was the Rumford Act, and that Pat Brown was identified with it. Would you disagree with that?
That the Rumford Act was a major...
that was the gut issue. There was a laugh
I disagree
over
that it was a key issue in the 66 election. Now, I might agree that after the...
we can kind of bog down again on 66. Let's talk about 68,
let's talk about
69.
after the election, when I will agree with you that the Rumford Act was a major problem in the state legislature with Governor Reagan as the governor. Now, what happened? He took the position he was opposed to outright repeal of the Rumford Act, because the outright repeal, if you recall, would not replace on the books the Unruh Act, which preceded the Rumford Act, and therefore the governor's position was for modification, major modification of the Rumford Act. And he was successful.
At first, he was for outright repeal.
No.
In the campaign, 1966. He unequivocally said he was for repeal of the Rumford Act. He got a standing ovation at the Realtors' dinner in San Francisco. I can't give you the date. I don't have the date, but he did get a standing ovation.
I was with the governor many times, and it's my experience that he gets standing ovations in front of every audience.
But what was it? What occasioned it?
I think the point we have to examine is what happened in the legislative year in 1966, when through the governor's leadership and sponsorship, in fact, a modified, amended Rumford Act bill was passed through the Assembly. And it did not get through the Senate. But it was the governor's program. It was the governor's sponsorship, and he had his full force behind it.
That was in the first session.
That was in the first session.
All right, let's once again shift the focus.
We're getting too parochial.
Yeah, you both brought up the universities, and I think that's an interesting issue to talk about. Jack, in your opinion, has the climate changed on the university campuses across California since the election of Governor Reagan?
I'm not sure that they have. I think what we have seen since the election of Governor Reagan is that the problems on the university campuses in this state are not unique to our university. That since then, we've seen the same manifestations show up in many places throughout the country and, in fact, throughout the world. And so we have a basic problem that's here. But in terms of stance, the governor has positioned himself to say, look, we have a basic public institution here that is supported by all the taxpayers. It has, as its objective, a meaningful purpose. And there is a disruption that's going on here that is not necessarily directly related to the process of getting an education. And so this is where he has come down with his position. The students at the university ought to obey the laws or get out of the university.
Matter of fact, he has that on a plaque outside his office.
It was in his speech once, and some supporter put it in bronze and sent it to him as a little memento. It's about the size of a business envelope,
yes,
and it has that direct photo.
Of course, he also said that the universities have no business subsidizing intellectual curiosity, which makes us wonder what the university experience is all about. But I'm very interested in the university.
Wait a minute, I got to take a break.
We'll be right back.
Joe, you were making a point when we broke there first.
Yes. Thinking of the university, this is really an American tragedy from every point of view. Again, I feel it's a bipartisan tragedy. At the time that Reagan's polls showed that he was really scoring on this issue, by that time, some of the turmoil that had existed at the university had somewhat lessened. There were still problems there. Clark Kerr had made mistakes in handling it, but some of the heat was off. Some of the excesses had blown off to some extent. The repercussions had just set in. You must remember that the University of California has many campuses. Berkeley is only one campus. Berkeley is sort of the flagship of the university system. There are approximately 28,000 students and perhaps 2,000 or 3,000 at most involved in disturbances at Berkeley. So that puts it in perspective. Also, you must remember that Berkeley is, up until the Columbia disorders, was probably the only campus that had 4 full-time reporters from metropolitan dailies assigned to it every day just to look for stories, which tends to accentuate some of the frou-frou business that goes on at schools. I noticed whenever I was down there and we were looking at that fleas market in the open square, whenever there was a TV camera, all of a sudden these guys with flowing robes would come out from somewhere. Somebody with sandals and thongs would get it right up in front. There might be 500 people with shirts and ties on, and some guy in flowing robes would come down, and the camera would zoom right in on them. So this is one of the problems you have. But I think it's very significant that when Clark Kerr was fired, one of the happy voices was that of Mario Savio, who said, "Good riddance to get bad rubbish. Governor Reagan has made an auspicious start." Now, I don't mean to say that Mario Savio supports Governor Reagan, but it's a very curious element. And I know you were going to suggest that I was saying that, and I'm not. A very curious element in American politics that opposites attract. In a sense, the excesses of the immature new left at the University of California and elsewhere galvanized public hysteria, the moderate, middle-class people who pay taxes and want to send their kids to get a good, free higher education. And I think the new left acted with malice of forethought to splinter the so-called liberal moderate coalition that had been running California for so many years since the time of Earl Warren. To the new left, the liberal moderates were worse than what they would consider the reactionaries or the far right, because they felt that terrible things were being done under the auspices of the moderate liberal coalition, that the university had become a war machine with NSA contracts and other kinds of contracts. They were determined to stop the machine. Now, I've talked to one of the fellows, Jerry Rubin, who was a leader, a non-student out there, who was leader of this Yippie movement in Chicago. And he said to me, in no uncertain terms, that we won't be happy until we close down the university. Well, they almost succeeded because of the hysteria that was ignited during the 1966 campaign. I also know it's a fact that some of the moderate Christopher supporters who came over to Reagan pleaded with him not to do this to the university. And he said, no, my polls show that this is a gut issue, and I'm going to stay with it.
Jack?
I think Joe's earlier comment, quoting the governor, that he didn't feel that the taxpayers should subsidize intellectual curiosity, I'd like to suggest that maybe that was out of context, Joe. I think if you'll examine the speech that he made from which he took the quote, you'll find that he was talking about a 3-unit course in the Davis campus for credit on how to hold street demonstrations.
And which he had taken out of context, because that wasn't the course, was it?
The quote that you used was... The quote that you used was, if this is intellectual, then I'm not sure that the taxpayers should be asked to subsidize it.
If this is intellectual. But he was basing it on misinformation about what was going on at the Davis campus. That was not the course. That was given as a subsidiary course, but it had nothing to do with the regular course of instruction.
There was another one on basket weaving for 3 units and a few others. And in context, he was saying if this is what intellectual curiosity is about...
But he had taken that out of context himself. He had made it look as this was part of the regular course of instruction.
I think it would be unfair to the audience if we just listened to the quote that you used to imply that the governor was supposed to...
But if we're going to extend it, let's extend it fully.
I think there's another practical way to look at the university problem, totally aside from politics, totally aside from whether it's Pat Brown or Governor Reagan. It's a very real problem for all taxpayers. In fact, we have a fabulous system. We've got a fantastic growth rate. We've got the greatest student population of any state in the country. And under the higher education plan proposed and in process of development in the state of California, we have provision for 9 university campuses of the size of Berkeley, with 2 more on the drawing boards. Now, these are not Quonset hut operations, as we saw after World War II. In fact, these are major, beautiful, granite, expensive, cost per square foot institutions. And when you start talking about the capital investment and the cost of running this, pretty soon it becomes the basic question of where's this money come from? Is this wisely being used? Is there some better way to use it? Is there a different program that we might follow to allocate on some kind of a cost per student to get more efficiency out of the dollar? And this same question that's going on at the university level, as it affects the governor in Sacramento, is the same one that's going on in the local levels, in every local level.
May I ask you this, Jack? These are good questions that you're raising. But I'm asking you this, really. Can these questions, these very hard questions of cost effectiveness, be answered in the heat of a campaign when we have all sorts of allegations about all kinds of excesses that presumably in the public mind characterize all the University of California students, or can they be best handled in the reflective, non-partisan, non-campaign atmosphere of administrators and politicians working together after the campaign?
Well, in fact, that's where it is handled. It's called the budget process, which the legislature must approve, the governor must sign, the Board of Regents must administer. And the facts show that the university had received more money from state. They had more operating money in 66 than they did in 65. That their current budget, 2 years in a row, they have more money to operate with this year than they did last year.
And why is the new president, Charles Hitch, complaining that the quality of education at the university is being endangered by budget cuts?
Well,
if this is so.
Now, there's a difference between a budget cut, a proposed budget cut, and an actual hard dollar authorized. Now,
yes.
If you're at this level, at this particular time, and your legislature asks you, what would you like to have for next year? And the university comes and says, I'd like to have this.
So there's always a natural increment.
Right?
Right.
And so after the reasonable discussion and the votes, you come down and say, you can have this. Now, you've got quite a bit more. You're talking about millions.
Jack, I have to stop you again. We'll be back with a final word for you in just about a minute or so from right now. The book is called What Makes Reagan Run? A Political Profile by Joseph Lewis. And it's interesting, especially if you'd like to trace the historical events that led to the election of Ronald Reagan and get a glimpse behind the scenes of some of the strange and bizarre workings of California politics, which nobody has been able to quite figure out just yet. Joseph, thank you very much for being with us.
Enjoyed being here.
Thank you, Jack. Thank you, all of you here in the house and out there at home. Bless you all and sleep well.